There's something quietly fascinating about the way stubbornness creeps into a conversation, not all at once, not like a switch flipping, but more like a slow tightening, like a door gradually closing while everyone inside is still talking. And that's the feeling that stays with me when I think about All in the Family, especially in those episodes where the discussion doesn't really evolve so much as it hardens, where every character stops trying to understand and starts trying to hold their ground. I keep returning to this particular kind of episode where the situation itself seems simple at first, almost ordinary. Something like Archie discovering that Mike has been attending meetings or supporting a cause that challenges everything Archie believes about how society should work. And the initial reaction isn't explosive, not yet. It's more like a tightening of the air in the room, a pause that stretches just a little longer than it should. Archie asks questions, but they're not really questions. They're statements disguised as curiosity, and Mike responds calmly, explaining his perspective, laying out his reasoning in a way that feels measured, thoughtful, almost patient, as if he still believes that if he explains it clearly enough, it will be understood. Gloria listens, watching both of them, already sensing where this is going, because she knows how these conversations tend to unfold, and in her gentle way tries to keep things light, tries to keep the tone from tipping too far in any direction, offering small comments that carry warmth, that try to remind everyone that they're still connected. For a few moments, it almost works. There's a rhythm to the conversation, a back and forth that feels like it could lead somewhere, like it might actually open up into something meaningful, something constructive. But then Archie says something that shifts the balance, something that reveals not just disagreement, but resistance, a refusal to even consider the possibility that he might be wrong. And that's when you feel it, that subtle change where the conversation stops being about ideas and starts being about positions. Mike responds, still calm, but there's a slight edge now, a firmness that wasn't there before. And he tries again, not just to explain, but to challenge, to push back against the assumptions that Archie is holding onto so tightly. And Archie doesn't move, not even a little. If anything, he becomes more fixed, more certain, repeating his perspective with more intensity, not because it's evolving, but because it's solidifying. That's the moment where stubbornness takes over, not just for Archie, but for everyone in the room, because once one person digs in, it creates a kind of gravity that pulls the others into the same pattern. Mike becomes more insistent, not necessarily louder, but more determined, more focused on making his point land. And in doing so, he also stops listening in the same way, because he's no longer trying to understand. He's trying to win. Gloria steps in, trying to bridge the gap, trying to translate between them, but even she starts to feel the pull, the frustration creeping into her voice, the sense that no matter what she says, it won't be enough to break through. Remains the softest presence in the room, offering kindness, offering perspective, but even her attempts begin to feel like they're bouncing off something solid, something unyielding. And this is where the show does something that still feels incredibly bold, especially considering the time it was made. Because instead of resolving this tension, instead of guiding the conversation back toward understanding, It lets the stubbornness stay. It lets it define the scene. The living room becomes almost like a pressure chamber, a place where the characters are confined not just physically, but emotionally, where there's no easy way out, no distraction to break the cycle, just the ongoing repetition of positions that aren't changing. It's uncomfortable, deliberately so, because you can feel the frustration building, not just in the characters, but in yourself as a viewer, that desire for someone to step back, to reconsider, to open up even a little. But that doesn't happen, or at least not in the way you might expect, because the show understands something very real about human behavior, that sometimes people don't soften in the middle of a disagreement. Sometimes they become more rigid, more certain, more entrenched. And that's where the humor comes from, not from clever lines or quick punchlines, but from the recognition of that behavior, the way people talk past each other, the way they circle the same points, the way they refuse to budge even when it's clear that nothing is being resolved. There's something almost absurd about it, but it's a grounded absurdity, one that feels familiar rather than exaggerated, and that's what makes it so effective. Archie's worldview is at the center of it all, not just because of what he believes, but because of how deeply he holds those beliefs, how they shape his identity, how they make it difficult for him to even consider alternatives. Mike and Gloria challenge those ideas, but they do it from their own positions, their own convictions, and that creates a kind of symmetry, a situation where everyone is certain in their own way, where no one is willing to step back. Again becomes the emotional anchor, the one who reminds you that there's still warmth in the room, still care beneath the conflict, even if it's not enough to resolve it. And when you think about the social context of the 1970s, it makes even more sense, because this was a time when a lot of these issues were coming to the surface, when generational divides were becoming more visible, when conversations about change were happening in real time, often without clear answers. The show captured that not by simplifying it, but by presenting it as it was, messy, uncomfortable, unresolved, and that's part of what made it so groundbreaking. It wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about reflecting something real, something that audiences could recognize even if it made them uneasy. And that unease is important, because it creates a kind of engagement that goes beyond simple entertainment. It makes you think, it makes you reflect, it makes you consider your own reactions, your own tendencies to become stubborn in certain situations. As the episode moves forward, the conversation doesn't so much progress as it loops, circling back to the same points, the same arguments, the same emotional beats, and there's a kind of rhythm to that, a pattern that becomes almost hypnotic. You start to notice the pauses, the moments where someone could shift the direction, could soften the tone, but chooses not to, whether consciously or not. And those choices matter because they reinforce the central idea that stubbornness has taken over, that the conversation is no longer about discovery, but about defense. By the time the scene begins to settle, there's no clear resolution, no moment of agreement, no satisfying conclusion, just a kind of quiet exhaustion. a sense that everyone has said what they're going to say, even if nothing has changed. And that's where the show feels incredibly honest, because it doesn't force a resolution that doesn't exist. It doesn't pretend that stubbornness can be easily undone. It just lets the moment be what it is. Personally, I find that approach both frustrating and refreshing. Frustrating because you want something to give. You want someone to break the pattern. And refreshing because it respects the complexity of real conversations, the way they often don't resolve neatly. And that's why All in the Family still feels relevant, because that dynamic hasn't gone away. People still have these kinds of conversations, still fall into these patterns, still struggle to move beyond their own perspectives. There's a kind of quiet brilliance in the way the show captures that, in the way it allows stubbornness to replace discussion without turning it into something exaggerated or unrealistic. It just presents it calmly, steadily, letting you sit with it, letting you feel the tension, the discomfort, the humor all at once. And as the episode comes to a close, there's no big moment, no dramatic shift, just a return to stillness, to the everyday rhythm of the household, as if the storm has passed, even though nothing has really been resolved. It leaves you thinking, not about who was right or wrong, but about the process itself, about how easily conversations can become fixed, how quickly openness can turn into resistance. And maybe that's the real impact of the show, not just the laughter it creates, but the reflection it invites, the way it holds up a mirror to something very human, very familiar. So the room quiets, the conversation fades, and you're left with that lingering sense of tension, not overwhelming but present, a reminder of how these moments unfold, how stubbornness can take hold, and how difficult it can be to let it go.